Moving on to AB 1218. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it would also result in significant general fund and special fund costs that are not consistent with the budget or our current fiscal plan. DGS indicates that it may require $2.4 million from the service revolving fund in 2016-17 and $210,000 thereafter. Of this amount, $2 million would be to contract for the design of a new IT system to track promotional efforts for the Disabled Veteran Business Enterprise Program, and the remainder would be for staff to analyze and evaluate the data. In addition to the DGS costs above, of those DGS costs, they believe that they would experience additional costs related to fiscal because the system does not currently have the capability to meet the bill's requirements.
Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Brown's remaining item, AB 1526. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance. I'm sorry, AB 1526. Oh, we forgot. Okay, we'll go back to that. It's,
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill. We think it's unnecessary and it results in additional state general fund costs of about $150,000 annually for 5 years for a total of $750,000. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention provides approximately 20% of the total annual funding for the survey now, and the remaining 80% comes from questions states pay to add to their respective annual surveys. Department of Public Health programs that wish to add questions to the California version of the survey are responsible for identifying funding to support those questions. This bill doesn't, or no state funding is appropriated for this purpose. And the Department of Public Health usually receives this sort of funding from universities, American Cancer Society, or other nonprofits. It currently costs $7,500 to add one question to the survey. So if they're adding 10 caregiver questions to the survey, it would be $150,000.
Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Going back to AB 1156 by Ms. Brown. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because of the unforeseen general fund costs, requiring local officials to notify felony offenders serving time in county jails in writing of their eligibility to petition for a certificate of rehabilitation and pardon as specified could result in a reimbursable state mandate. Right now that only applies to state prisoners, which means the requirements are on CDCR only and not a mandate.
Thank you. Without any comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 361 by Assemblymember Ashajian. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're neutral on this bill because it extends the sunset date on a statute requiring a utility that operates a nuclear power plant in California to fund state and local emergency preparedness and response activities associated with that power plant. Without the sunset extension proposed by the bill, the Office of Emergency Services estimates that it would lose approximately $8.5 million to support costs and $13 million in local costs between 2019 and 2024.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblymember Steinnorth's items, AB 363, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill, and we think it would streamline the closing of polls process. Secretary of State has indicated that any costs would be minor and absorbable.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1342, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed unless amended is sort of our position on this bill. Right now, the bill has a one-time general fund appropriation of $120,000, and that establishes 2 permanent positions in the bill as well. So we're opposed both because there's a general fund appropriation and that it's specifically for permanent positions, but it's a one-time appropriation. We don't have any objections to the sunset extension.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assembly Member Pereira's items, beginning with AB 384. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 617, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Mr. Garza, he's been here all day.
Tenacious.
I like it.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. Pablo Garza with the Nature Conservancy, and we're here in opposition to AB 617. Our chief concern is with the change from the same data to consistent data. And in addition to the costs identified by the committee analysis, we think this will result in illegal conflict down the road in those basins where multiple agencies are jointly managing the groundwater. I think they'll make different assumptions because of that change and therefore end up in court. We also think in the long term, this will increase costs to the State Water Resources Control Board when it goes in and exercises the quote unquote state backstop under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act that we just passed last year. And for those reasons, we're opposed.
Thank you. Any additional witnesses in opposition? Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because of costs. The Department of Water Resources estimates the bill will cost $100,000 to $500,000 in one-time general fund for modeling support, data analysis, and development of regulations to manage data received from different groundwater sustainability agencies.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 904, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill. We think that the bill is premature. The Air Resources Board has just begun a pilot program in the San Joaquin and South Coast Air Districts to provide funding to low-income individuals who scrap a high-emitting vehicle and replace it with a cleaner, newer used vehicle. The Air Resources Board in these local air districts should be given time to implement and assess the success of that pilot project before establishing a new program.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1124, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill, but we believe that it would result in initial costs in the range of $1 to $1.1 million from the Workers' Compensation Administration Revolving Fund, with ongoing costs of approximately $1 million annually for the department to establish the outpatient prescription drug formulary for workers' compensation benefits, update it on a quarterly basis, publish the 2 reports, and engage with stakeholders and promulgate regulations. The cost would likely be offset by overall savings to the workers' compensation system, which a report published by the California Workers' Compensation Institute found could potentially be in the range of $124 million to $420 million annually.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assembly Member Dodd's items, AB 401, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it creates a new obligation for the Department of Community Services and Development that requires additional fund resources not consistent with the current budget. Because the bill does not include an appropriation of funds, the department would not have the ability to secure the necessary general fund resources prior to July 1, 2016. So the department will have insufficient time to meet the reporting requirements of the bill.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 664, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We're opposed to this bill. We think it's unnecessary, would be difficult to implement, and imposes additional costs on the state's general fund that were not included in the budget. The bill results in increased costs to the Department of Healthcare Services in the range of $500,000 to $1 million, half of which would be general fund, to evaluate the outcomes and lessons learned from the assessment tool and report this information to the legislature. However, these costs are contingent on the successful implementation of the universal assessment tool, which to date has not yet occurred. If the tool has not been implemented with enough time to complete an evaluation by the bill's deadline of January 1, 2017, the ability of the department to complete the report is uncertain.
Thank you. Any comments or questions? Without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. AB 1354. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill. According to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, the bill could result in additional general fund costs for staff to review and approve non-discrimination programs that pursuant to this bill are required to be submitted to the department by certain employers. However, the department's actual review is discretionary, so costs are difficult to estimate because they would depend on the number of non-discrimination programs received by the Department of Fair Employment and Housing and their decisions to review and certify them.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 423, Senator Cooley. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it imposes new requirements and a higher level of service on counties, requiring an appropriation of general fund above the 2015 Budget Act level. The bill requires counties to perform additional CalWORKs and ARC case management activities for foster youth placed into a relative caregiver's home. In addition, the bill increases the ARC program costs by entitling teen parents placed in relative caregiver homes to receive an additional $411 per month infant supplement. As of July 2015, 48 counties have opted into the program. This bill imposes new administrative and payment requirements on counties with respect to the program, imposing a higher level of service that has an overall effect of increasing county costs. Because this program was realigned, the bill would increase general fund costs under realignment and may motivate counties to opt out of the program and could discourage the remaining 10 counties from opting in.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 704. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No position at this time, but the Department of Insurance estimates that the bill would result in both costs and revenues to the insurance fund. The costs stem from the Department of Insurance promulgating a new form for insurers to submit for review of surety bonds, from coordinating the release of existing deposits and processing new securities in conjunction with the state treasurer, and from ongoing costs to track the two different levels of security. The revenues come in from processing. The revenues come in from work that's billable to the newly regulated underwritten title companies, and it results, however, in net costs. And so for fiscal year 15-16, the Department of Insurance estimates net costs of $160,000. In 16-17, $41,000, and then in 17-18 and beyond, it drops to $24,000 net cost.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we will move the item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assembly Member Chu's items. AB 433. Witnesses in support.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. Jessica Bartholow with the Western Center on Law and Poverty. We are a sponsor of the bill. This bill has resulted from real-life situations in which CalWORKs families have lost a child and immediately following lose the benefit allocated for that child, with a reminder that children who live in deep poverty are more likely to die than children who don't, and that all of the children who are living in the CalWORKs program with the benefit level that we have are living in deep poverty. We respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because it imposes a new state mandate on counties to provide CalWORKs recipients information and referrals to various supportive services outside of CalWORKs. Currently, CalWORKs families who experience a child death are eligible for a good cause exemption from welfare to work activities. The assistant unit's monthly cash grant is accordingly adjusted downward beginning in the month following the child's death. The number of annual child deaths occurring in an aided household is unknown.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move that item to a suspense file. Moving on to AB 1387. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill, but we do note that The Department of Social Services believes that it significantly increases its administrative workload, and that the department will require some level of additional general fund resources to comply with the provisions of the bill.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Speaker Atkins' items, beginning with AB 437. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Franchise Tax Board estimates a revenue loss of $22 million in 2015-16 and $27 million in both 2016-17 and 2017-18 from this bill. The bill is also expected to significantly impact FTB's costs, as it will require the development of an application process for electronic filing and services, grant certification, database development and testing, and a noticing system to allow for the new grant program.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Moving on to AB 1288. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance. Oh, go ahead. Opposition or support?
Opposition.
Opposition. Please go
Brent
ahead.
Newell with the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. This bill extends ARB's authority to implement cap and trade. ARB does so through an auction whereby it sells the right to emit carbon into the atmosphere. It is generating massive amounts of revenue in the post-Prop 26 world. This requires a 2/3 majority for this bill to become law and extend that authority. For those legislators who are interested in a way to price carbon and allocate the revenues from carbon, a carbon tax is a much more efficient and elegant way to price carbon and distribute the revenues and wouldn't result in such significant administrative overhead. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions or comments on this item? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to the remaining items from Assemblywoman Irwin's items. Moving on with, beginning with AB 930. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
No file.
No file. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 931. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because we think it's too soon to consider piecemeal changes to the state's new economic development initiative that abolished the Enterprise Zone program and redirected the funds to 3 new business incentives. As more data becomes available on the efficacy and utilization of the new initiative, changes should be considered in a more comprehensive manner. We would also note that the FTB estimates a general fund revenue loss of $20,000 in 15-16, $150,000 in 16-17, and $250,000 in 17-18 from this bill.
Comments or questions from the committee? Seeing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1045. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because we view it as unnecessary. Cal EPA and the state entities named in the bill are currently coordinating efforts to meet the goals and objectives included in the bill.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving right along with Assemblymember Ridley Thomas's items, beginning with AB 446. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance is having problems with her folder.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill. The fiscal impact of continuing the Conservancy beyond the sunset date are the operating costs of approximately $726,000 annually. This amount includes $378,000 from the Environmental License Plate Fund and $348,000 in bond funds.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 766. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it is premature until funding exists for the program. Should funding be allocated to this program in the future through the budget process, associated statutory changes could be considered at that time as part of a budget trailer bill.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1030. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it's unnecessary. The Air Resources Board estimates costs from the bill to be minor and absorbable within existing resources. We concur with the estimate, as such guidance can be included in the overall funding guidelines to state entities involved in the disbursement of GGRF cap-and-trade auction proceeds currently under development. Staffing and ongoing resources have already been provided to the Air Resources Board to support giving guidance to state entities responsible for the allocation of cap-and-trade.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we will move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 1299. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill as it would result in additional costs for the Department of Healthcare Services to implement new policy guidelines for presumptive transfers of responsibility and may also result in increased costs for counties to coordinate the provision of specialty mental health services for foster youth. The bill results in approximately $311,000, $156,000 of which is general fund in 16-17, and $293,000, $147,000 of which is general fund ongoing for the department to develop regulations specific to presumptive transfers of responsibility and to monitor and report on jurisdiction disputes between counties. The bill may also result in additional general fund costs for counties to coordinate the provision of specialty mental health services provided to foster youth. The responsibility for specialty mental health services was one of the programs realigned to counties in 2011 as part of 2011's public safety realignment. So pursuant to Prop 30, which was approved by voters in November 2012, any legislation enacted after September 30th, 2012 that has the overall effect of increasing costs already borne by the local agency for programs or levels of service mandated by the realignment requires the state to provide additional funding to cover those costs.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblyman Patterson's item, AB 649. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because it's unnecessary. The Department of Public Health is currently authorized to approve the use of pharmaceutical incinerators. Law enforcement agencies may request a permit to operate these incinerators, subject to the Department of Public Health's existing application review process for the use of medical waste incinerator technologies.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. I have officially become sick of hearing myself speak. Just wanted to throw that out there. I don't think it would actually happen, but it's happened. It's
You're doing a great job. We're joining you with that.
The day has come. I never thought that would happen, and it's happened. Moving on to Senator Williams' items, beginning with AB 485. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance opposes this bill because it could increase the Department of Food and Agriculture's unplanned general fund operating costs in excess of $100,000 annually, beginning in 16-17. Additionally, the Franchise Tax Board estimates that the bill will reduce personal income tax revenues by about $8,000 annually.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 645.
Come up here.
Christian Molina on behalf of the Sierra Club in support of the bill.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill because it aligns with the first of the governor's climate goals from his 2015 inaugural address, increasing the proportion of the state's electricity that's derived from renewable resources. The PUC estimates that this bill requires $123,000 from the utilities reimbursement account for one analyst position and $1.5 million annually for consulting costs for 5 years to engage in modeling and forecast to implement the bill. The Energy Commission estimates that the bill requires $868,000 from the Energy Resources Programs account on an annual basis for 6 permanent positions to develop regulations to implement the bill and collect a greater amount of data to verify and track the procurement of renewable energy resources. As always, any request will be evaluated during the budget process in the fall.
I'm sure it will. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 802, witnesses in support.
Christian Molina on behalf of the Sierra Club, California, in support.
Thank you. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
Department of Finance is neutral on this bill due to its potential to result in significant energy savings. In this regard, it aligns with the governor's 2030 climate goal.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to suspense file. Moving on to AB 864, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
While we agree with the intent to better protect California's coastline and wildlife from oil spills, the Department of Finance is opposed to this bill because we think it's premature. It expands the Office of Oil Spill Prevention and Response's regulatory authority over pipelines. However, that agency has no authority to require specific design, construction, or operation standards for a pipeline. So we believe that the bill exposes the department to potential litigation with significant costs because of the denial of a contingency plan, which could ultimately lead to the industry filing a preemption lawsuit. This bill also results in increased costs to the Oil Spill Prevention and Administration Fund. We're estimating $198,000 and 2 additional positions in 2015-16 and $213,000 ongoing.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving to AB 967, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on the bill. Higher education institutions would be required to comply with the provisions as a condition of receiving state funds for financial aid. The UC and CSU indicate that they can absorb the new costs from the bill. The community college's chancellor's office indicates that community college district costs would be approximately $200,000 statewide.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to a suspense file. Moving on to AB 968, witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
This bill doesn't create additional costs for the UC and CSU because its provisions are consistent with their existing policies. However, the community college's chancellor's office reports that each college would incur one-time costs ranging from $1,000 to $3,000 to update systems that produce transcripts. This is likely a mandate, which would be reimbursable to all of the community college districts.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to Assemblywoman Eggman's items, beginning with AB 515. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
The Department of Finance is opposed to this bill due to its negative impact on state revenues, due to increasing the credit percentage from 10 to 15% and changing how donated items are valued. Tax credits are usually implemented to encourage a socially desirable behavior that would not have happened without the financial incentive. While increasing donations to food banks is a laudable goal, it's unclear that the credit will significantly increase new donations versus merely subsidizing the activity that would have occurred anyway. In particular, this bill enables donations to be valued at the wholesale cost of similar items sold, regardless of whether the food is saleable at the time.
Thank you. Comments or questions from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file. Moving on to AB 564. Witnesses in support. Witnesses in opposition. Finance.
We don't have a position on this bill. The bill results in no net change in revenues collected and provides DDS the ability to collect the fees more consistently. DDS estimates a decrease of approximately $187,000 in revenue generated by the program for 2016-17 due to the revised fee schedule and the exemption for parents with income between 100% and 200% of the federal poverty level. The decrease is estimated to be fully offset by improved program compliance due to documentation requirements and additional fee collection remedies authorized in the bill. We would note that the bill makes a fee-supported program development fund continuously appropriated, but it also specifies that the fund is subject to allocation in the Budget Act, so we're not sure how those things are going to work together.
Thank you. Questions or comments from committee? Seeing and hearing none, without objection, we'll move this item to the suspense file.